This should totally be the thumbnail. Hey guys, Omar here, and today we're looking at the Ricoh GR3 versus the Ricoh GR3 X. Fooled you there, didn't I? These are very, very similar cameras, except for a couple of things. And if you're watching this video, you're probably trying to decide between these two because, yeah, you want both. But we have two special editions. The first one is the GR3 Street Edition, which has this really pretty yellow orangey ring and a grayish sort of tone to it. I really, really like this. This is probably the first thing we should talk about is which one's prettier. And then we also have the GR3 Urban Edition, which is bluish, which I think I like a little bit more. I kind of like the blue ring there. Really, really nice. So we have the street edition and we have the urban. There should be like a rural edition, photographing cow. Now, which one of these you choose depends very much on what you're shooting and how you're shooting. So we're all different, so it's nice that we have choices. The GR3 original has about a 28 millimeter field of view, which is a little wider than kind of normal. And the GR3X has a 40 millimeter lens, which is just a little bit more, let's say, normal, a normal field of view, very flat, very real, as opposed to the GR3, which is just a little wider, a little wackier, if that makes sense. This is, of course, a scientific test, because that's what we do here. We'll talk about focal length in a second. Let's talk about some other things I have not written down here, because I don't cheat. But all right, the first thing is minimum focus distance with these two. The Ricoh GR3 can get closer in minimum focus distance than the GRX. And in the macro mode, you can get a little closer, you can get a little bit more detail out of the this is getting confusing, the GR3 original gangsta. Oh yeah. If you're into doing selfies of yourself, you're gonna have to go with the GR3 because of the wider lens. The 40 millimeters a little tough if you're gonna, if you have people around you and you want to shoot photos, you're gonna have to use your phone. All right, just as a quick aside, why would you get one of these, which are like $1,000 US, instead of using your phone, which is also $1,000 US? And the reason is the sensor on this is really, really detailed, really great dynamic range, and super, super sharp. Much sharper than the 1-inch sensor that I have in a Sony ZV-1. And way better than my phone so far. Phones are getting better, but they're not there yet. And I would say if you're a Lightroom user, the files that I'm getting out of the GR are a lot clearer and sharper than the Fujifilm files. Now, this is not a Fujifilm problem. This is like an Adobe problem. Okay, people, if you want to photograph people, I did some comparisons. The GR3 original is great if you get people with a little bit of context, a little bit more of the scene. With the GR3X, you get a little bit more compression. The background gets closer to your subject. And with the 40 millimeter lens, you get a little bit more blur in the background. Although I'm used to mega blur. Jumping back to Fujifilm for a second, I noticed that shooting portraits with the Fujifilm compared to the GR, the Fujifilm putting a Provia skin on there to me gives me more pleasing skin tones than the GR, which if you put camera standard, everybody turns yellow, which is weird. With that said, with this camera, I'm not really looking to do portraits. I want to do street scenes, which I tend to edit a little bit more dramatic than a regular portrait. All right, autofocus between the cameras. I did some real scientific tests, and the autofocus is pretty meh. on both cameras. It works fine, and I actually like using a single focus point. It has fancy face detection and it has continuous, autofocus, but I don't use any of that. I just use a single focus point. And if you're not too familiar with these cameras, they also have something called snap focus, which is you can put a predetermined distance, punch it into the camera, and I've been using the touchscreen for that. You touch the screen, it sort of sets the camera for a certain aperture to get everything in focus. The only negative with that is that it cranks the ISO up, because I also told it to please give me one minimum shutter speed of 1/200th. And so your ISOs go way up. And on this camera, once you get 1600, 3200, 6400, they get a little grainy. But sometimes you kind of want to just grab a moment. So snap focus is good for that. But you know what's better than snap focus? Snappy focus. When you're shooting kind of like the Sony a7 IV on the street with a single focus point, you can just point to anywhere and it'll grab focus. And this would allow you to shoot a little bit more wide open as opposed to f11 or f16. So I appreciate snap focus, but better than the street edition or this urban edition, everyone's waiting for the 4th edition of this camera with super snappy autofocus. Compositions with these two. So I would say that the GR III X is a little simpler if you're looking at things and you're framing them up, because everything's flatter on here. You can get your lines a little straighter. And if you have time to make a composition, the GR III X 40mm, I think, is better for that. Like this guy right here with his dog, I'm like, hey, can I take your picture? I started with the GR III, got a super wide of the scene, then moved closer. But then with the GR III X, I was able to get a little bit more compression, a little bit more flatness. But if you look at them side by side, it's kind of like, I like the GR III a little better for its wackiness. I call it wackiness, but it's just a little wider. But if you're sort of trying to find moments and you're looking for people and you're sort of shooting from the hip, you want to be a little wider, especially if people are close to you. Again, that's personal taste, and it's nice that we have choices. I'm just hoping that this video is helping some of you if you're deciding not just between these two cameras, but which focal length you should use on the street. And by the way, this is not sponsored by anyone, so why don't you just watch it again and hit like and all that stuff. Subscribe. The other thing is with 28mm, you can crop a little bit more in if there's a moment that's a little further away. You have 24 megapixels, APS-C, you can crop in a little bit. This is more forgiving, the 28mm. With the 40, I found that if a scene was just way too wide, it kind of was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to stitch this later, because this is so wide. And I feel when I travel, and that's when I probably use this camera, is you're taking everything in. There's a lot of scenes that are wide. So I would prefer to have the 28mm over the 40. However, it depends. I found that if you want things that are far away to get closer, of course the 40mm is way better than that. When I was across the river from New York, there was like a big cruise ship and people were watching it. The cruise ship is so far away on the GR III, but it gets just a little bit closer, enough to make sense with the GR III X. So when you need compression, that's why it's better to have a zoom lens on a camera than these guys. You shouldn't have to choose. But if I were to choose, what I enjoy more with this little camera is I'm always looking for little scenes. A scene where there's multiple people, multiple things going on. That seems to be where my street photography is sort of gravitating towards, is looking for little, paintings of a particular moment in time. And I think the GR III original 28mm is better for that. That's just me. A couple of things that probably need more testing. I tried to do some sharpness tests between these two, and I found that the GR III X was sharper in the middle. But when I would go to the corners on both of these, the same photo, the GR III original was just sharper across the whole board. I don't know if that's I did the test 3 times. I looked. I didn't really want to report it because I'm not good at those things. But I think that maybe is the case with the two cameras I have. The other thing that's a little weird is I set the cameras identically with auto white balance. And it seemed like the original GR3 was just a little bit more on the green side, and this one was more neutrals, better auto white balance maybe on the newer one. I don't know. Their lenses are supposed to be what's different, but that's glass. They could have different glass. But anyway, that's something I noticed. You like? Which one would you choose? What's great about these cameras, once you have a focal length, it kind of becomes your focal length. You don't really think about 28. If you got 40, you make photographs that are 40 millimeters. So don't stress about it too much. All right, I hope that helps someone. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you, Ricoh, that we have choices like this GR3. You see how upside down is. There we go.